Hey guys, this is Supernova reading How Do We Know the Bible is True, Volume 1, co-edited by Ken Ham and Bodie Hodge. And today I'm going to try to take on two chapters. Now, these chapters are particularly long, so I don't want to go point by point over them. Mainly because they include a lot of factual information. I'm not a historical scholar, so all I can do is cite others. And so can they, because the authors are not historical scholars either. This first chapter, chapter 16, is called 3 Days and 3 Nights, about how long Jesus was allegedly in the tomb. And it's co-written by Bodie Hodge and Paul Taylor. They've both written chapters before, so I've already introduced them. Bodie Hodge has a degree in mechanical engineering, and Paul Taylor is a chemist. So I will read you the first chapter because it's very important. Most Christians believe Jesus was crucified on Friday and raised from the dead on the following Sunday. However, some believers have put forth arguments in support of Jesus being crucified on Wednesday or Thursday. Most agree that the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, was when Christ rose from the dead. This is based on Matthew 28:1, which states, "Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb." Now this is all the treatment they give to the whole idea that Jesus rose again on Sunday, and it's insufficient. Let me read you again their citation that's meant to prove when Jesus rose. "Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb." Does that say anything about Jesus rising from the dead? Now, of course, this is out of context. Maybe it goes on to say it, but it doesn't. If you read all of the accounts at the end of all the Gospels, they all have the same basic story. The women go to the tomb, they find it already open, and a person says, Jesus isn't here, so you missed him. As soon as they arrive, Jesus is already gone. If he had left 5 minutes after being put in the tomb, the resurrection accounts would still turn out the same. So there's absolutely no way of knowing when Jesus left. Now you may point to Matthew and say, yes, but in Matthew, it's the one that contradicts the other where they see the tomb getting opened. The rock is rolled away in front of them. But they don't see Jesus stumble out or anything, and the angel says the same thing. He's not here. If they had seen Jesus come out and it just hadn't mentioned it, it doesn't make any sense. The angel would tell them, hey, he's not here. Because remember, you just saw him wander off a few minutes ago. It doesn't happen. And Christians don't believe that the Jesus would have been held in there by the rock anyway. That doesn't make any sense. In the end of Luke and John, we have the story of Jesus appearing to the disciples, and that's what it says. He just appeared in their midst. People speculate that maybe he walked through the walls, or maybe he teleported. It doesn't matter. Whatever skill he used there, he could have used in the tomb. And if he's omnipotent, obviously, no rock is going to hold him. So we're told by the stories themselves that he's gone by Sunday morning. So it doesn't seem that even if we give the benefit of the doubt on the first day, that there's any establishment of him being there until the time of the women visiting. So since this is the only treatment that they give to the end date, they can't establish that it was 3 days and 3 nights. But still, they're going to try to establish the first day. So let's see what they have to say about him. They quote several passages in the Bible that say Jesus will rise again on the third day. They give the argument that we've heard from many Christians counting days in the Bible. They say, well, it may say 3 days, but the Jews counted differently. Now, they're going with the whole idea that Jesus was buried on Good Friday, on the Friday before the Sabbath, because a passage in John says, therefore, because it was a preparation day that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So it's establishing that the crucifixion happened just before Sabbath, and that's why he's got to be dragged away immediately. And so because of that verse, they believe, well, it had to be a Friday, even if that doesn't make sense in the counting of days. They try to make sense of it. They say that the Jews counted their days differently. It started at sundown rather than at midnight like we count. So if Jesus died on Friday afternoon, then that's day one till about 5 or 6 whenever the sun goes down that day. So a few hours is day 1. And then you have all Friday night through Saturday, which would be day 2. And then you have Sunday morning till Sunday night would be day 3. But supposedly they believe Jesus is in the tomb for Sunday morning. So that's day 3. That's dishonest. That's a day and half a day and a few hours of a day. So maybe 40 hours at most that they're calling 3 days. It's a dishonest interpretation of 3 days and 3 nights. If I said that I had been working on this video for 2 days and I gave you the details, well, I started taping it about a quarter to midnight on one day and then a little past midnight on the next day, you'd say that's not 2 days. That's not even 1 day. That's less than an hour. And you would be right. It would be dishonest for me to call that 2 days, even if it happened on 2 days. And there are some passages in the Bible where they talk about the 3 days, and they pretty much establish that it is 3 days, not just on the 3rd day. For instance, Matthew 12:40, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That sounds like an entire 3 days, as we know it. It doesn't matter when they count days. I'm sure they knew that a day was 24 hours, and a reader would be expected to know that. Now also keep in mind, when they whip out this whole Jewish day counting thing, it's only for protecting this contradiction in the resurrection account. I've never heard a Christian bring this up whenever they're talking about days elsewhere. For instance, Jesus was 40 days and 40 nights out in the wilderness where he was tempted by Satan. I've never heard a Christian say it was anywhere from 38 to 40 days because of how they count their days. No, they don't. And I've even heard people put forth how perfect 40 days is because that's just the point where you start getting all these diseases. It would have made him suffer the most, like anybody cares. Well, any non-Christian would care. And they don't say, but it might have been just 38 days and Jesus might have survived. It's just fine. No, they never make this reference elsewhere. When in the account of Jonah, we don't hear, well, it might have been a little less than 2 days because, of how they account. No, when people read that, they say, yeah, 3 days as we know them because they don't have a contradiction to fix. So they just read it as the section tells it. When we're talking about the creation account, the 7 days of creation, you never hear any Jesus was resting for a day, but it might have been, a minute or so because it wasn't technically a day as we know it. No, we never hear another place where this Jewish accounting system is brought up except here because they're trying to protect from contradiction. Now, when they explore difficulties, their main one is the book of John, where it contradicts the other scriptures by saying that Jesus died a day earlier. In Matthew through Luke, we have the account of Jesus having the Passover with his disciples. He says, this is my blood with the wine, and this is my body with the bread. And these were things that you would eat at Passover, and he was imbuing them with new meaning, having to do with his death and resurrection. We don't have that story in John because there was no Passover dinner. Instead, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is taken before Pilate, and his accusers stand before him and try to get him jailed. And Pilate is astonished. He marvels at the fact that Jesus doesn't put up his own defense. But in John, we have a totally different story where Jesus is in trial all by himself and the inside of Pontius Pilate's palace, and the chief scribes and Pharisees and priests and such were outside because it was preparation day for the Passover and they didn't want to enter a place that was unclean. And so they bring their points against Jesus, and Jesus responds when Pilate goes back, and he's just making this trip back and forth trying to decide this, and he's not marveling over Jesus' silence because Jesus talks, because it wouldn't make sense if he didn't, because it's a completely different narrative. And the reason that this happens is because John tries to put Jesus' death at the time that the Passover lambs are sacrificed, at the exact same time. He's trying to make Jesus the metaphorical sacrificial lamb of Passover. And to do this, he has to change the facts, because that happened before the Passover feast. Now, what these guys are going to argue is that they believe that the disciples had a feast of their own, that there were as an entire day where you could have the Passover feast. They had it at night before, but most people would have it the next day, like the chief priests and the Pharisees. They would have it the next day, which only makes sense if that John contradiction is the only one you look at. But if you look at Matthew and Mark, I don't know the specific references off the top of my head, but you find that they wanted to arrest Jesus, but they said, we're going to wait until after the Passover because we don't want to create a stir. We don't want to disturb the Jewish ritual for this. And it doesn't make sense if they are doing it in their own Passover, if they're doing it over normal, everybody involved Passover. It doesn't make sense for them to jump ship and do it just after the disciples have had their Passover. So the only way that they make their point is by completely denying that fact and ignoring it. And that's basically it. I don't think there was anything else to note here. So in conclusion, they believe that it was a Friday crucifixion, and they think that it was over the course of 3 days, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So on to chapter 17, the framework hypothesis. This is co-written by Tim Chaffee and Bob McCabe, and I think they've already written chapters before too. I know Tim Chaffee just wrote 2 briefly before this. The framework hypothesis is just basically the liberal, moderate Christian view of Genesis 1, the creation account. How they claim that it is left free of biblical constraints, as they say, trying to make it fit with the whole scientific view of how the universe started. And I'm not going to argue so much with this, because I kind of agree that Genesis 1 isn't really written as if it could be read as a metaphor. It doesn't make a lot of sense to read it as a metaphor unless you believe that the universe is actually billions of years old and you want to try to still make the Bible true and relevant. I'm not even going to go over really what the framework hypothesis is. It just doesn't really matter. They presuppose that the universe is only 6,000 years old, and there's a section in here called the importance of presuppositions, where they argue that the reason for the framework hypothesis is because others are presupposing that science is true. And they take a little knock at science, but I don't care. You already know how they feel about science. And so basically they just argue that Genesis 1 ought to be read literally. And I think I just mentioned this. The whole account of days could easily be taken metaphorically, because they haven't established what a day is when they start the creation account. A day is one revolution of the earth in its position to the sun. It doesn't make sense for there to be such a thing as a day unless you have a rotating earth and a sun. A day on earth is not the same as a day on another planet. A day is not a universal unit of measurement. And of course we ought to expect that, since it's being written to earthlings, that we ought to know what a day is, and it's talking about 24-hour periods. But nonetheless, it's reasonable to say, well, a day could be any sort of measurement. In addition, these same fundamentalists who believe that the 7 days of creation are literally days, in other contexts will argue that time is metaphorical. Consider Daniel's 70 weeks. the book of Daniel has a prophecy of what's going to happen over these next few weeks, and Christians believe that they're weeks of years. It doesn't say weeks of years in the text. They're just trying to fit it to what actually takes place after that prophecy supposedly happened. That they Because it wasn't literal weeks, they don't take it as literal weeks. When we see that the Bible says that Jesus will come back soon, many people point that out, and even show in the scriptures where Paul is writing to people who believe that Jesus already came and went, because they knew what soon meant. And so they're like, do we already miss it? And so 2,000 years later, these fundamentalist Christians are saying, oh no, soon doesn't really mean soon. And they often quote this verse that a day to God is like 1,000 years, which implies that God has no sense of time, which is silly. But if you take that standard consistently, then maybe each day in the Genesis account is 1,000 years, and God just doesn't know what he's talking about when he inspires people to write a day. But anyway, I digress. I really don't care whether Genesis 1 ought to be literally interpreted as 7 days or a lot longer, because I don't believe that the creation account is true. I agree with the liberal and moderate Christians when they believe that the scientific account is true. I don't see any reason, as they do, to fit Scripture to it. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed these chapters. I didn't. I thought it was rather dull, and there's very few citations for any of their claims to when certain things happened on the Passover. So I spared you that. I don't care, and I hope you don't either, because I skimmed right over it. Till next time, we got some better chapters coming. Peace out.